I kept taking notes, while my father smiled at the room like he'd already won. "We're selling the company," Richard Bennett announced, resting both hands on the conference table. "The board has approved the acquisition. Today's shareholder vote is simply the final formality." Applause echoed through the room. My older brother, Daniel, leaned back with a grin. "Looks like everybody's finally getting paid." Around me, aunts, uncles, and cousins whispered excitedly about vacation homes, early retirement, and luxury cars they planned to buy after the sale closed. No one looked in my direction. I raised a hand. "As Chief Financial Officer," I said evenly, "I'd like to review the final transaction documents before the vote." My father didn't even glance at me. "That's unnecessary." Several relatives chuckled. Daniel smirked across the table. "You handle spreadsheets, Morin. Leave strategy to people who actually built this company." More laughter. I lowered my hand and quietly returned to my notebook. The vote proceeded anyway. Every family member lifted a green voting card. "Motion passed," my father declared proudly. "Congratulations, everyone." The investment bankers began organizing paperwork, while our attorneys exchanged folders. Then one of the bankers' phones rang. He answered casually. 5 seconds later, every bit of color drained from his face. He slowly stood. "I'm sorry." The room became silent. "The bank has suspended the transaction." My father's smile disappeared. "What are you talking about?" The banker swallowed. "The controlling shareholder has declined the sale." No one moved. My father stared at him. Then his voice cut through the silence. "Who owns 82% of my company?" No one had an answer. For 12 years, I had sat at tables exactly like this one. Most people knew me as Richard Bennett's daughter. Employees knew me as the CFO. Banks knew me as the person who solved impossible financial problems. But inside my own family, I was treated like someone who merely recorded decisions other people made. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't cost me so much. I had joined Bennett Industrial at 22, immediately after earning my accounting credentials. While my father attended industry conferences and accepted awards, I stayed behind rebuilding damaged financial systems that had nearly pushed the company into default after the recession. When suppliers threatened lawsuits, I negotiated payment schedules. When payroll was at risk, I refinanced debt that no one else believed could be refinanced. When 2 factories nearly shut down because of cash flow problems, I spent weeks sleeping on the office couch while rebuilding operating budgets from scratch. Every crisis ended the same way. The company survived. My father accepted public praise. Daniel gave interviews. And I returned to my office before anyone noticed. It had become normal. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. 3 days earlier, I hadn't even known the company was being sold. I learned about it from our corporate attorney, who mistakenly assumed I had already received the board packet. When I asked my father why the CFO hadn't been included in negotiations, he smiled politely. "The board already has everything it needs." That was the entire explanation. No invitation. No discussion. No financial review. Despite overseeing every dollar flowing through Bennett Industrial, I wasn't considered important enough to participate in the largest transaction in company history. Now, after the vote, relatives gathered around champagne bottles that assistants had wheeled into the conference room. Daniel slapped our father on the shoulder. "I told you she'd overcomplicate everything." Richard laughed. "Sometimes experience means knowing not to ask unnecessary questions." Neither of them noticed I was still sitting at the finance table. I looked down at my notebook. The final line I'd written before the vote simply read, "Transaction documents never reviewed by CFO." I underlined it once. Across the room, the investment banker ended another phone call. This time, he looked even more unsettled. Our legal department needs everyone to remain here, he announced. No one leaves until ownership verification is complete. The celebration stopped instantly. Every conversation died. And for the first time that afternoon, my father looked genuinely worried. No one spoke as the conference room slowly emptied. The celebration had vanished. Champagne glasses sat untouched. The only sounds were hurried footsteps and muted phone conversations spilling into the hallway. My father turned toward me the moment the last relative stepped outside. His face was no longer confident. It was furious. What did you do? I looked up from my notebook. I don't know what you mean. The ownership records, he snapped. The bank says someone controls 82% of this company. I heard the same thing you did. You maintain the capitalization table. I maintain the records, I corrected. I don't create them. Daniel shut the conference room door. Stop playing games. I'm not. He folded his arms. Then explain how an 82% shareholder magically appeared. I met his eyes. They didn't magically appear. The room fell silent. My father stepped closer. What did you just say? I said ownership doesn't change because a bank discovers it. His jaw tightened. If the records are accurate, then someone has controlled this company for years. And if that's true, I replied calmly, today wasn't the first time. Neither man answered. For several long seconds, they simply stared at me. Then my father pointed toward the records department. I want every historical share certificate, every trust agreement, every transfer ledger, everything. Now. An hour later, I unlocked the company's archive room. Unlike the polished executive offices upstairs, the archive was quiet, cool, and untouched by renovations. Decades of company history rested inside gray filing cabinets and fireproof safes. I began pulling corporate minute books onto a large table. Original stock ledgers, annual reports, old shareholder registers. Everything was meticulously organized, exactly as I had kept it. As I worked, memories surfaced with every document. I remembered being 24 years old, sitting alone in this same room after midnight while the company's lenders threatened foreclosure. My father had been across the country, attending an industry conference. Daniel had been on vacation. I spent 40 straight hours restructuring loan schedules before the banks opened Monday morning. The deal saved nearly 400 jobs. When the newspapers covered the recovery, the headline read, Richard B. and NETT LEADS Company turnaround. My name wasn't mentioned once. Another memory followed. 5 years later, steel prices surged. Our largest customer canceled contracts. Cash reserves disappeared almost overnight. Again, I negotiated emergency financing. Again, vendors agreed to stay. Again, the factories kept operating. At the annual shareholders' banquet, my father raised a glass. My son Daniel has become the future of this company. The room applauded. Daniel smiled. I was sitting 3 tables away. No one acknowledged the woman who had prevented bankruptcy 6 weeks earlier. The pattern never changed. Whenever I suggested stronger governance, we'll discuss it later. Whenever I asked about long-term ownership planning, those decisions belong to the real owners. Whenever I questioned major transactions, you're here to advise, not decide. After enough years, I stopped expecting anything different. I simply kept the company alive. I opened another cabinet. Near the back sat several oversized legal envelopes, unlike anything else in the archive. Heavy cream-colored paper. Deep red wax seals. Each carried the same handwritten instruction. To remain SCALED, unless ACTIVATED under Article VII. I frowned. I'd inventoried this room dozens of times. I'd never been authorized to touch these. I carefully picked one up. The wax seal remained perfectly intact. Whoever placed these here expected them to stay unopened for years. I reached for the letter opener, lying beside the ledger books. Don't. The voice came from behind me. I turned. Standing in the doorway was Harold Whittaker, the company's outside attorney for more than 30 years. His expression was calm, almost solemn. His eyes settled on the sealed envelope in my hand. He slowly closed the archive room door behind him. Then he said quietly, "Those documents were never meant to be opened unless today happened." "What do you mean, unless today happened?" Harold Whittaker walked toward the archive table without answering immediately. He placed his leather briefcase beside the sealed envelopes and rested one hand on the oldest filing cabinet. "For 32 years, he said quietly, "I've been instructed to protect certain corporate documents until a specific condition was met." I looked down at the envelopes, and today met that condition. He nodded once. "It appears it did." Before I could ask another question, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I answered. "Where are you?" he barked. "In the archives." "Good, get upstairs." "Why?" "Because Dad's calling an emergency shareholders meeting." The line went dead. Harold picked up his briefcase. "I suppose it's time." Less than 30 minutes later, the main boardroom was full again. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from earlier. No champagne. No laughter. No congratulations. Instead, executives whispered nervously while family members refreshed financial news on their phones. Outside the glass walls, employees gathered in small groups. Rumors had already spread throughout the building. The sale collapsed. The buyer backed out. Someone secretly owns the company. Nobody knew which version was true. Television screens in the lobby displayed financial headlines. Acquisition of BENNETT Industrial DELAYED over ownership dispute. Employees exchanged worried looks. Some feared layoffs. Others feared bankruptcy. The uncertainty spread through every floor of the company. Richard entered the boardroom looking far older than he had that morning. He didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing at the head of the table. "We have a serious problem," he announced. His eyes shifted directly toward me. "And that problem begins in our finance department." Every face turned. I remained seated. The bank relied on capitalization records maintained by the CFO. He paused. "If those records are wrong, this entire disaster belongs to Morin." A few relatives immediately nodded. Daniel leaned forward. "I've been saying for years that finance has become too centralized." One of my uncles added, "How does someone overlook an 82% shareholder?" Another relative shook her head. "This is exactly why businesses shouldn't depend on one person." The accusations came quickly. None of them asked a single question first. I folded my hands on the table. The capitalization records have been audited every year. Richard laughed bitterly. "Then explain this." "I can't explain assumptions people made without reading the records." Daniel scoffed, still hiding behind accounting language. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm describing facts." Harold Whittaker finally stood. "If I may." The room quieted. Richard gestured impatiently. "Go ahead." Harold opened a thin folder. "I can confirm one important point." Everyone leaned forward. "The controlling voting interest is not the result of a recent acquisition." Several people exchanged confused looks. He continued. "The shares are held through an irrevocable founders' trust established many years ago." Silence. Richard blinked. "A what?" "An irrevocable founders' trust." Daniel frowned. "Who's the beneficiary?" "I'm not authorized to disclose that." The room erupted. Impossible. Who approved this? Why didn't anyone know? Can we challenge it? Richard slammed his palm against the table. I want legal action filed immediately. We're suing. Harold didn't flinch. On what grounds? Fraud. There is no evidence of fraud. Then concealment. The trust was structured under applicable corporate and trust law. Richard's voice hardened. I don't care. I want it overturned. Harold calmly closed the folder. Attempting to invalidate an irrevocable trust without legal basis would almost certainly fail. Daniel stood. So we're supposed to let some anonymous investor destroy this deal. Harold looked directly at him. I never said the shareholder was an investor. The room fell silent again. Before anyone could press him further, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Read the message. Then slowly slipped the phone back into his pocket. I've received confirmation. Richard immediately stepped forward. Confirmation of what? Harold looked around the table. The trust's beneficiary has agreed to appear before this board. Nobody breathed. He gathered his papers, closed his briefcase, then said quietly, You'll meet the controlling shareholder tomorrow morning. He walked out of the boardroom before anyone could stop him. No one noticed that, for the first time all day. I hadn't asked a single question. The next morning, Bennett Industrial no longer felt like the company I had walked into for 12 years. Instead of employees discussing production schedules and customer orders, every conversation centered on one question. Who owned 82% of the company? Outside the headquarters, television vans lined the street. Industry reporters waited near the entrance. Inside, every executive's phone seemed to ring every few minutes. The uncertainty was beginning to cost real money. At 8 o'clock, Richard called another emergency executive session. The investment bankers appeared by video conference. None of them looked optimistic. The lead banker cleared his throat. We've received instructions from our lending syndicate. Richard folded his arms. What now? All acquisition financing has been suspended. The room froze. For how long? Daniel asked. Until legal ownership is verified. Richard's face darkened. That could take months. Possibly. And the buyer? The banker hesitated. They've issued a formal notice. He opened a document. If controlling authority cannot be legally established immediately, they'll terminate the purchase agreement. Daniel slammed a pen onto the table. This is unbelievable. The banker remained calm. The buyers are unwilling to proceed, while ownership is disputed. The call ended. Nobody spoke. For the first time since announcing the sale, Richard looked uncertain. Not angry. Not arrogant. Simply uncertain. The consequences spread quickly. Independent directors who had enthusiastically supported the acquisition suddenly began asking difficult questions. Who verified shareholder authority? Who approved the voting process? Why wasn't ownership confirmed before negotiations? No one answered immediately. Eventually, every question pointed toward Richard. He had insisted everything was under control. He had personally certified the company's authority to sell. Now those certifications were being questioned. One independent director finally said what everyone else had been thinking. If this board authorized a transaction without proper ownership approval, we could all face serious legal exposure. The room became painfully quiet. Several directors quietly moved their chairs away from Richard's end of the table. It was a small movement, but everyone noticed. While the executives argued upstairs, I returned to the archives. Harold had given me temporary access to records I had never been allowed to examine before. This time, I wasn't searching for ownership certificates. I was looking for answers. Inside an old leather file, labeled simply Founder, Personal Correspondence ***, I found handwritten letters addressed to Harold over nearly 20 years. Most discussed succession, leadership, responsibility. Then I found a letter written only months before the founder passed away. I recognized his handwriting immediately. He had hired me shortly after college. He had always called me into his office whenever major financial decisions were being made. At the time, I assumed he simply appreciated my work ethic. Now I wasn't so sure. One sentence caught my attention. Ownership should never belong to the loudest voice. It must remain with the person willing to protect the company when applause disappears. I slowly lowered the page. Suddenly, dozens of forgotten conversations returned. The founder insisting I attend governance meetings. His repeated questions about long-term planning. His habit of asking what I would do, not what my father wanted. Then another memory surfaced. A week before he retired, he had smiled at me. Stewardship matters more than titles. At the time, I thought he was giving career advice. Now the words felt completely different. Upstairs, Richard's confidence continued to crumble. He gathered every family shareholder into a private conference room. "No matter who walks through that door tomorrow," he said firmly, "we stay together." Daniel nodded. "They're trying to divide us. They won't succeed." Richard pointed around the room. "We speak with one voice." An aunt asked quietly, "What if the shareholder wants different terms?" Richard didn't hesitate. "There are no different terms. We're selling. And if they refuse?" Richard's jaw tightened. "They won't." But his voice lacked the certainty it had carried the previous morning. 9 o'clock arrived. The full board assembled. Independent directors, family shareholders, outside auditors, corporate counsel. The investment bankers returned. No one spoke above a whisper. A security officer opened the boardroom doors. Everyone instinctively stood. 2 legal assistants entered first, each carrying sealed archival boxes. Behind them walked Harold Whittaker. In his hands rested a thick binder containing original trust documents. Richard glanced toward the hallway. "Where is the shareholder?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He carefully placed the binder in the center of the boardroom table. Then another figure entered. A senior trustee from the law firm. Everyone assumed he represented the mysterious owner. Richard even stepped forward to greet him. "Thank you for coming." The trustee simply smiled politely and took a seat. Harold looked around the room one final time. Then he opened the binder. He didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at Daniel. Instead, his eyes settled on me. The room followed his gaze. He gave a respectful nod. "Ms. Bennett." Every head turned toward me. "Are you ready to accept recognition as trustee?" The room went completely still. Every face turned toward me. Daniel looked from Harold to me, then back again as if waiting for someone to laugh. Instead, Harold remained standing. "I'll ask again." He looked directly at me. "Ms. Bennett, are you prepared to formally accept recognition as trustee under the Bennett Founder Preservation Trust?" I slowly stood. "Yes." A collective gasp swept through the boardroom. Richard stared at me. "No." He shook his head. "No, that's impossible." Harold opened the original trust binder. "It is not impossible." He carefully removed a series of aged documents. The Bennett Founder Preservation Trust was executed 23 years ago. He placed the originals before the board. The founder transferred 82% of the company's voting shares into this irrevocable trust. One independent director adjusted his glasses. "And the trustee?" Harold answered without hesitation. "Morin Bennett." Daniel actually laughed. This has to be some kind of mistake. Harold calmly slid another document across the table. It has been audited, registered, and reaffirmed over multiple corporate filings. Richard grabbed the paperwork. His hands shook as he read. No. He flipped through another page. Then another. Every signature was genuine. Every filing carried official seals. Every transfer matched the company's historical ownership records. He looked at me. You knew. I answered honestly. No. His eyebrows lifted. What? I knew the records were accurate. I didn't know they belonged to me. Harold nodded. That is correct. The trust prohibited disclosure, even to Ms. Bennett herself, unless an attempt was made to sell the company without satisfying the preservation provisions established by the founder. One director leaned forward. What provisions? Harold opened another page. The company could not be sold unless the trustee determined the transaction protected employees, preserved the company's long-term future, and served the founder's stated purpose. He looked around the room. Those conditions were never reviewed. Silence. The attempted sale automatically activated the trust's disclosure clause. The investment banker slowly nodded. Our lending department rejected the transaction because authorization from the controlling shareholder was legally required. He looked toward me. When that authorization was declined, the transaction became impossible. Richard lowered himself into his chair. His confidence disappeared. So, I never had authority. You had operational authority as chief executive officer, Harold replied. But you never possessed controlling voting authority. Richard looked like a man discovering his own history had been rewritten. One of the independent directors broke the silence. Mr. Whittaker, when was this trust created? The founder began planning it after the recession. Everyone looked confused. Harold continued. He watched executives protect their own reputations, while one young financial analyst quietly worked through the night to prevent bankruptcy. His eyes met mine. That analyst was Morin. I remembered those nights instantly. The empty office. Cold coffee. Sleeping on the couch between negotiations. Thinking no one had noticed. Apparently, someone had. Harold continued. The founder spent years observing who consistently placed the company ahead of personal recognition. He reached one conclusion. Leadership is proven during sacrifice, not during celebrations. He removed one final handwritten letter. This was addressed to the future trustee. He handed it to me. With slightly trembling hands, I unfolded the paper. The founder's familiar handwriting filled the page. If you're reading this, someone has chosen profit over stewardship. They may believe ownership belongs to the loudest voice in the room. It never does. Ownership belongs to the person willing to protect what others are willing to sell. I quietly folded the letter. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Richard finally looked at me. His voice was softer than I had heard in years. You could have challenged me. I didn't know I had that right. You could have demanded recognition. I asked for it many times. He looked down. He remembered. Every meeting. Every dismissal. Every time he told me decisions belonged to real owners. Daniel leaned back in stunned silence. After years of introducing me as the accountant, he couldn't bring himself to say a single word. Around the table, several longtime executives exchanged knowing glances. One of them, our plant operations director, quietly stood. I've worked here 28 years. He looked directly at me. I know who kept this company alive. Another executive rose. Then another. Without anyone saying a word, they applauded. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just long enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly who had earned their respect. Richard didn't join them. He couldn't. Business resumed immediately. The acquisition agreement was formally terminated. The buyer withdrew its offer within hours. No litigation followed. There was no legal basis to force the sale. At the next board meeting, independent directors introduced a motion to replace Richard as chief executive officer. This time, the voting process followed the company's actual ownership structure. As controlling trustee, I cast the deciding vote. The motion carried. Richard was removed as CEO. His years of leadership were acknowledged respectfully, but the board concluded that attempting to sell the company without verifying shareholder authority had exposed Bennett Industrial to unacceptable legal and financial risk. Daniel's expected promotion disappeared with him. The position was never offered. Instead, the board began a nationwide search for experienced executive leadership. When the new governance plan was presented, I declined the role of chief executive officer. "I've spent my career making sure the company survives," I told the board. "I don't need another title." Instead, I accepted the position of chair of the board. An experienced manufacturing executive from outside, the family was hired as CEO. For the first time in company history, executive appointments would no longer depend on family relationships. We also adopted new governance policies. Every proposed sale would require independent board approval. Employee representatives would participate in major strategic discussions. Profit sharing expanded across every manufacturing facility. Transparency replaced family politics. Within 2 years, Bennett Industrial achieved its strongest financial performance in company history. Customers who had hesitated during the ownership dispute returned. Banks increased our credit facilities. Employee turnover reached its lowest level in decades. Family gatherings became quieter. Richard and I remained civil. Time softened the anger, though it couldn't erase the years behind it. Daniel eventually accepted a management position at another company. We spoke occasionally, mostly about business, never about that meeting. One afternoon, months later, I walked into the boardroom before everyone else arrived. The room looked almost identical to the one where my father had announced the sale. I paused beside the chair where I had once sat taking notes, while others made decisions for me. Then I walked to the head of the table, not because I wanted power, but because responsibility had finally caught up with recognition. Before the meeting began, I placed the founder's handwritten letter inside the board's permanent records. Not as a reminder of who owned the company, but as a reminder of why it should never belong to the wrong people.